Neil Burton as a student when I was a student at the University of British Columbia in 1970, and he was doing a master's degree at UBC at the time, and the theme of his master's degree was the history and dynamics of the Cultural Revolution. This is in 1970. So as you can imagine, it was a chaotic time, a wonderful time in which we got to know one another, and we helped establish the East Asian Students Association at the University of British Columbia. Neil went to McGill in 1972 to do his PhD with Paul Lynn, and I followed him there. He welcomed me into his home for a number of months. He then left Canada in 1973. I remained in Montreal, and he left as part of the first Canada-China student exchange. And he went to China at that time, and he remained there for 8 years, studying, also working, and he taught also in China. But after 8 years, in 1981, he went to Japan, where he lived, worked, and taught again for 17 years. He was devoted to understanding China and spent much of his time reading and writing about China after he returned to Canada in 1998. And as I mentioned, he lived on Salt Spring Island, but he taught here at the University of Victoria, and he also taught at the University of Toronto as a visiting lecturer. And so he was very much dedicated to China-Canada friendship and understanding China's development. He died in 2010 after a long fight with cancer, and in commemoration of his spirit, we established the Neil Burton Commemorative Fund to continue Neil's work of understanding China and East Asia and promoting friendship among the peoples of Canada and the Asia Pacific. So that's the story behind Neil Burton. He was a wonderful man. He was so open and a friend to all, and he was a gentle soul. And we think that his spirit is with us tonight, and it continues to motivate many of us in the work that we do. So the Neil Burton Commemorative Fund is a fund that's supported by individuals. It's a small fund, but it does useful work in helping to sponsor talks like tonight's talk with the support of the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives. So I hope you'll consider contributing to the Neil Burton Commemorative Fund. Any amount will help, and all you need to do is to write a check and send it to this address with a notation on your check, Neil Burton Commemorative Fund, and all of the funds are used to support activities such as the one we're having tonight, and it's guided by 3 members of the History Department and in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives. So it's also my pleasure in introducing members of the family who have joined us tonight. I'd like to, well, I'm not sure everybody's there yet, but they are just entering, and the man who entered and took off his hat in a very formal way, coming into a room, is Neil Burton's older brother, Donald Burton, and he's here with his partner, Cynthia. We also have Neil's sister, Nancy, who is here with her partner, David. And we have 2 of Neil's children here. Barbara and Jamie are both here from Salt Spring Island. And besides them, we have also a person who was very dear and was very close to Neil, especially in the final years of his life, and nursed him through much of that period. Brian Smallshaw with his partner Rumi is here as well. So if you would like to meet or talk to them about Neil, I'm sure they'd welcome that opportunity. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Helen Lansdowne, the Associate Director of the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, who's going to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Mark Sidel.
Thank you, John. Welcome everyone. On behalf of the Center, we're thrilled to be helping to host this evening. Mark is a longtime friend of the Center, so it's a pleasure to bring him out of snowy Wisconsin and into our balmy weather in Victoria. It's very fitting that Mark give this talk tonight, as he knew Neil in the 1970s in China. Mark had gone over to teach English, and they struck up a friendship. Mark is with the University of Wisconsin, as is above. He's the Doyle-Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs. He has recently completed service as the President of the International Society for Third Sector Research, the International Academic Association working to strengthen research on civil society, philanthropy, and the nonprofit sector. Mark's areas of research, not surprising, include nonprofit and philanthropic organizations in the United States, and in comparative perspective, civil society and the law, comparative constitutionalism, particularly in China, Vietnam, and other parts of Asia. And in addition to his academic work, Mark has been very active on serving on boards and councils for the nonprofit sector, and he advises many of the largest foundations in the United States. He's very involved. His most recent publication is entitled State, Society, and the Market in Contemporary Vietnam, Property, Power, and Values, which he co-authored with Hui Tan Ho Tai. Please join me in welcoming Mark Sidel.
Thank you. Delighted to be here and honored to be here to give the Burton Memorial Lecture. It was a pleasure to meet and spend some time with members of the family, and I'm grateful to JB and Brian and other members of the family for some of the photographs that you're going to see here tonight. I have a presentation for those of us who don't like PowerPoint, which includes me. It is a PowerPoint presentation, but it's almost entirely pictures, which is perhaps the saving grace of using PowerPoint. This year is the 35th anniversary of the key international political and theoretical debate about the future of China that occurred in the immediate post-Cultural Revolution era. And that was a debate that pitted Neil Burton, here shown in one of the pictures that the family has very graciously allowed me to use as a young Canadian graduate, shortly to go off to China, against a lion of the post-World War II left in Europe, Charles Badelheim, a famous French Marxist philosopher and political theoretician. These two forces converged in and around China in the late 1970s, in particular 1977 and 1978, as China was emerging from the Cultural Revolution. But the story of how Neil Burton and Charles Badelheim converged obviously goes back much further than 1977, 1978. Part of the story goes back to the Sino-Soviet split of the early 1960s and the mid-1960s, the precursor to the Cultural Revolution in China, one of the precursors to the Cultural Revolution in China. Neil Burton is not in this photograph, which has Mao Zedong greeting Khrushchev before the Sino-Soviet split. Charles Badelheim, the French philosopher who took one side in this great debate about China's course after the Cultural Revolution, sided with revolutionary forces in China at the time of the Sino-Soviet split. He had been active with revolutionary movements around the world, and in particular with the leaders of revolutionary movements around the world, going back many decades. This is Nasser from Egypt, Charles Badelheim on the left, back in the 1950s. Letters between Professor Badelheim and Che Guevara in Cuba. Badelheim had been very active in working with the left of the left forces in Cuba, both before and after the revolution, in the great debate in Cuba about moral versus material incentives, a debate that came up again in China both during and after the Cultural Revolution. These letters are available in publications that Professor Badelheim's students produced after his death. Meanwhile, in Canada, Paul Lynn, as many here know, was among the pioneers of China and Asian studies here in Canada in the post-World War II era. Neil was one of his students, very close to Professor Lin, whom I had the honor of meeting only once or twice, I think once in Canada and once in China. As Professor Price has indicated, Neil studied with Professor Lin both in Vancouver and in McGill, and then went off to China in 1973, a China that was emerging, just beginning to emerge from the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, as all of you know, took place in two stages, in effect. A less orderly, in some cases, many cases, much more violent stage, from 65, 66 through about 69, 70. And then a stage, and this was the stage in which I first went to China in 1972, and Neil first went to China in 1973, a phase of what one might call Cultural Revolution consolidation, which was marked by immense political struggle between forces in China, and a gradual opening, beginning in 1970, 71, first to Canada, then to the United States and other countries as well. That's the China that Neil arrived in 1973 and stayed in for 8 years, and many of you know at least the basics of that story. This kind of political warfare that's talked about in this slide, for those of you who know Chinese, this is criticism of the pre-Cultural Revolution leaders who were deposed during the Cultural Revolution, in particular Liu Shaoqi, who's mentioned first in the black lettering above the slogan. This was emblematic of the early stage of the Cultural Revolution. Some of this, the Red Guard movement, was gone. All of this was gone by 1973, but it was still a time of intense political struggle among factions within the central leadership when Neil arrived in 1973. The family has been gracious enough to provide me with a number of pictures of Neil in China during this era. Pictures that span the range of his time in China. This is Neil on what I believe to be the Shanghai docks. This is before 1976 and the death of Mao. We can date this roughly because of the Mao badge that Neil was wearing, which were ubiquitous in the years before Mao died in 1976. For much of his time in China before this great debate, and let me, if we could, I'm going to pass around, so those of you who haven't seen these before, at least one of you actually brought a copy of this tonight. I'm going to pass around the key documents from this debate, just so those of you who've never seen this can take a look as I pass them around. For much of this time, not all of this time, as I understand it, but for much of this time, Neil lived in an extraordinary place in Beijing, extraordinary for its era, called the Friendship Hotel, which some of you have visited. Today, the Friendship Hotel is an ordinary, old compound hotel, a huge compound hotel in northwest Beijing. But in its time, in its real time, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Friendship Hotel was the center of the foreign community, the foreign non-diplomatic community in Beijing. An extraordinary array of foreigners who had come to China to support the Chinese Revolution by teaching, by editing, by doing research in various ways, lived or passed through the Friendship Hotel. And Neil came into contact with an extraordinary group of foreigners who, in some cases, had been living in China for many decades. I'll show you a few examples of these foreigners, but there's a very large community. Han and I were talking about this today. At the height of the Cultural Revolution, at the time when Red Guard bands were literally battling on the streets of Beijing, there were several hundred foreigners living in Beijing at the time. Canadians, Americans, lots of others as well. This is Neil on the far right. You'll recognize him. Many of you will recognize him. With two Americans who had lived in China since the late 1940s. Joan Hinton, who is on the far left. This is Neil's wife, second left. And Sid Angst, second right. Joan and Sid were emblematic of the foreigners who had come to China in the late 1940s, in many cases on relief work or on military work. They had come with the United Nations Relief and Reconstruction Administration, UNRWA, and stayed on to support the Chinese Revolution, eventually settling after they came out of the revolutionary base areas in Beijing at a place called the Red Star Commune, south of Beijing, where they pioneered the dairy industry and dairy production, modern dairy production, in China, along with their Chinese colleagues. They died in the past, Joan died in the past 3 or 4 years, Sid died a bit before that, but they had lived in Beijing and been visited by foreigners all the way back to the 1950s. For those of you who work on China, Joan was the sister of the extraordinary writer William Hinton, who wrote Fan Shen and a number of other wonderful books about China. But there were lots of other foreigners in Beijing when Neil arrived in 1973. He would have met Israel Epstein, who worked at China Reconstructs and the Foreign Languages Press, who was on the far left in this picture, a progressive journalist who had been in China also since the 1940s. It's possible that Epi had been in China actually since the 30s. The extraordinary intellectual Saul Adler, the tall gentleman who is second from the left, close friend of mine from those years, who lived in China since after he was forced out of the United States due to McCarthyism in the 1950s. Had settled in China and had become a researcher and political analyst, working with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, then, which was operating under a different name through the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and other groups in China, including with the government, for many years. Gentleman's third from the left, most of you will recognize, and one hopes that the students in the audience would recognize this as Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Revolution. And fourth on the left, first on the right, an American economist who also arrived in the 1950s, again as a refugee from McCarthyism, named Frank Ko, who also lived in Beijing with his family throughout the 60s, 70s, until Frank died in Beijing in the late 70s. This was the kind of community that Neil was joining, but there were also diplomats and journalists and lots of other people. By 1973, Beijing was beginning to open up. And so Neil, as Professor Price indicated, worked in a variety of jobs in Beijing, first as a student and doing research, and then teaching, and working as an editor at Radio Beijing, which was a home to a number of foreigners at various points, both before, during, and after the Cultural Revolution, teaching journalism at the new Institute of Journalism at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, doing a variety of other work. He came to know China extraordinarily well. The date on this picture is mid to late 70s. Jamie has a date on the picture. What's that?
I think it was 74, 75.
The books would indicate to us that this was a very early picture. There was very little being published in China at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. Neil had what was being published because he was an extraordinary student of Chinese language and Chinese politics. And so you see the dictionaries and some of the political volumes from the time in the bookcase behind him. When Jimmy so kindly sent me this picture, and several of the others you're about to see, I was of course interested in the picture of the family members who were in the picture, but I was also interested in the bookcase because for me that puts this toward the very end of the Cultural Revolution, before book publishing beyond dictionaries, political tomes, some poetry, things like that, began again. This is the gentleman who just spoke at the back of the room, Jamie, as a young character in Beijing in 77, 78?
And I would have been 77, I was 15.
Living with his father in Beijing in the Friendship Hotel. This may look sparse by modern North American standards, but this was in the Friendship Hotel where the foreign community lived. It was about the best you could do in Beijing at that stage, and foreigners like Neil, this has all changed today. China has changed dramatically today, as you all know. But this would have looked somewhat like how the leadership lived as well, in terms of this level of relative comfort. Other pictures from the Friendship Hotel, also from this same era. China was already beginning to change by the time Neil and his family were into their 4th and 5th year in China. Mao had died in 1976, and a new leadership, a temporary leadership, headed by a gentleman named Paul Gofeng, who many of you are familiar with, who died in the past couple of years, had taken power briefly. But then by 1977 and 1978, Deng Xiaoping had reassumed power on behalf of a group, Liu Shaoqi and others, that had had some power before the Cultural Revolution. obviously engaged in factional fighting with Maoist and other forces before the Cultural Revolution. This was a time of immense change in China. And again, this is a picture of the family at Beijing Airport, if I recall correctly, in 1979. And some members of the family with Neil in 1979. But again, it was interesting for me because what was in the background. This was the Beijing Airport, which has now been supplanted by an even newer Beijing Airport. But because this was 1978, 1979, more modern art was being allowed. And several of the murals and paintings that were put up, some of you who are familiar with those days in Beijing may remember this, several of the murals and paintings, including the one that happens to be seen by random happenstance in the back of this picture, that were put up in Beijing Airport in 1978, 1979, when this then new airport was built, came under intense criticism from more conservative officials for showing too much nudity, showing too much skin. There's another painting not in this picture, which actually contains the first nudes to have been publicly shown in artwork in Beijing after the Cultural Revolution. But this painting also came in for some criticism. More scenes from Neil in China in the late 70s, early 80s, before the departure for Japan in 1981. This is in the Omei Mountain region in Sichuan. Another family picture taken at the Friendship Hotel, also late 70s, early 80s. You'll recognize Jamie again in this picture. This is taken in Xinjiang. In the late 70s, there were parts of Xinjiang in northwest China that were still closed to foreign visitors. Depending on the year in which this picture was taken, Neil would have had to have had special permission to travel out to Xinjiang, at least to some parts of Xinjiang. And the late 70s, when Neil was doing investigative trips around China, along with other foreigners, trying to figure out what was happening in this new China after the Cultural Revolution. And this picture and the next picture, two extraordinary pictures of Neil with miners underground, and the next picture above ground in the Daqing oil fields. Just remarkable pictures for which I'm grateful to the family for providing for this presentation. For the foreign community in Beijing, this was a very confusing time. Many of them had supported the general political principles of the Cultural Revolution, trying to reduce social inequality in China, trying to elevate the status of the peasants, trying to do away with economic incentives in industry and agriculture where possible, and replace them with moral or political incentives. These were some of the issues that had led to the Cultural Revolution, which had, as many as you know, devolved into factional fighting. By the early, mid-1970s, the values of the Cultural Revolution were in many cases gone, but some of the principles that had animated the Cultural Revolution were still alive, especially in the pro-China progressive movement, progressive community outside China, but also in the foreign community in Beijing. Charles Bettelheim was the key foreign theoretician who upheld the values of the Cultural Revolution and who felt, and this is where he and Neil Burton diverged, felt that the leadership in China that could take those values forward was the so-called Gang of Four, Jiang Qing and her three counterparts. And when Jiang Qing and the other members of the Gang of Four were arrested, put into prison in October 1976, a portion of the European and North American left that had supported China began to move away from China. Bettelheim was the most famous and one of the leaders of this group that moved away from China, saying through a series of documents, and I'm passing those around, the issue of Monthly Review from 1978 and the book that emerged from that, saying that China was emerging on a path that was counter to socialism, that would result in rapidly increasing social inequality, and that the new leadership should be opposed. Bettelheim argued this in a series of works about China, but he had a long history of looking at socialist experiments and the ways in which socialist experiments tried to maintain their values. So again, a couple more pictures of Bettelheim. This is Bettelheim in the center, with Le Duan in Vietnam in the early 1970s. And Bettelheim on the left with Premier Zhou Enlai in the early 1970s. Again, the button dates this pretty early, probably 70, 71. This is, we don't have a clear, this is not the clearest picture, but this is probably a Serve the People or other badge from Mao's quotations rather than a Mao badge itself. And that probably dates it to Zhou Enlai in about 69, 70, 71. By the time Zhou Enlai was meeting Americans, including my parents, in 1971, some of the buttons were already beginning to disappear. This was still the Cultural Revolution, but it was a different stage of the Cultural Revolution. This was a lion of the European left. This was someone who had sided with China, as I said at the beginning, during the Sino-Soviet split, sided with the Che Guevara, Fidel Castro forces against more conservative forces in the Cuban Revolution, and was very quick to give up on the Chinese leadership that took power from the Gang of Four in China. The death of Mao in 1976, some of the posters, the kinds of posters that Neil and some family members saw when they took a train trip through China in 1976, early 1977, shortly after the death of Mao and the fall of the Gang of Four, Jiang Qing in the bottom left, and the other members of the so-called Gang of Four. And by 77, 78, the Western progressive movement, Western progressive intellectuals, were enmeshed in a very sharp debate about the future of China and whether China was regressing or moving forward. This debate coalesced around the journal Monthly Review, which some of you may be familiar with, an independent socialist journal. The green magazine that I'm passing around is the 1978 issue of Monthly Review, and there's another one circulating as well, that Neil and Charles Bettelheim wrote in. This is Bettelheim on the left, and the extraordinary editor of Monthly Review, an economist named Paul Sweezy, who lived outside of New York and worked at the Monthly Review offices for many years, beginning in the late 1950s, all the way through his death in the late 1980s. Monthly Review was, and the word independent is as important as the word socialist, a highly independent, at times iconoclastic journal. It was at times criticized for its links, for its ties to the revolutions in China and Vietnam, but it could also be very independent as well. And Paul Sweezy on the right, and his remarkable co-editor, Harry Magoff, who is still read today for his work on imperialism in both US, UK, and other contexts, decided in 1978 that this debate within the foreign left about what was happening in China should be reflected in the pages of Monthly Review. They collected several documents, documents that became famous and began to be translated around the world. They collected, and these are in the book and the issue that are in front of you, they collected Charles Bettelheim's resignation letter, very pugnacious resignation letter from the presidency of the China Friendship Association in Paris. They collected a document written by a young Canadian teacher and researcher and editor in Beijing named Neil Burton that they titled, this was not, as I understand it, Neil's title, In Defense of the New Regime. And they collected a long piece in response to Neil's shorter commentary by Charles Bettelheim about how the Chinese leadership had gone astray from the principles of socialism. Even though Deng Xiaoping had retaken power in 1978 in China, the course of the Chinese Revolution and Chinese modernization was by no means entirely clear at that point. Even when I arrived in China to teach in 1979, there were still debates going on about how far China should go in terms of economic reform, in terms of economic incentives, in terms of privatization of land, in terms of allowing private business, whether small scale or large scale. By now, 35 years after this debate, most of those questions, as you know, have been settled. China has become a remarkably privatized nation, despite the fact that it's still led by a communist party. But these issues were not entirely clear in 1978, and struggle was still going on. So there was interest in China in the fact that the European and North American progressive intellectual groups, which had supported China, going back to the Sino-Soviet split, were now themselves split over the direction in which China was going. The monthly review issue that was published in 1978, which was one of the most widely distributed issues of monthly review, up until that time, showed up in student coursework, showed up as graduate student reading, etc. Then came out as a book, and I've circulated the book as well, for those of you who are interested in taking a look at it. And these were some of the questions that Neil asked. I won't read those. This is one of the, there aren't many slides in this PowerPoint presentation that are actually text, but the worst thing about PowerPoint is when speakers like me actually read the text on a PowerPoint slide. So I won't do that. But these are some of the questions Neil was asking. He wasn't saying that Deng Xiaoping's government was necessarily the best government for China. He was saying that, in as careful a way as he could, because Bettelheim was one of the most prominent Marxist intellectuals in the world at that time. He was saying as carefully and as diplomatically as he could, the Chinese people have spoken here. It's not necessarily up to us to give a verdict on whether they're right or wrong. Some of the assumptions outside China about where China is going may be correct or may be incorrect. But let's give it some time and not automatically dismiss Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues, especially when, from the perspective of living in Beijing, Neil was saying in this piece, and I'm digesting a 20-25-page piece into a few paragraphs here, it looks to us, as a foreign community living in Beijing, that the vast majority of the Chinese people that we come in contact with are against the Gang of Four who was arrested, and are supportive of some of the reformist efforts that Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues are trying to take. Now, some of this is couched in the political and theoretical language of the times. And that's a particular debate style and a particular language that was used at those times, and it was used within what was then a very broad political and theoretical community. So this was very widely read. But there was a sense in Beijing that Bettelheim and his colleagues, including some associated with Monthly Review in New York and elsewhere, had moved too quickly. And that even though this looked like a backtracking on some of the values of the Cultural Revolution, that this kind of opening, moving toward more governmental accountability, trying to redress some of the excesses, including deaths of the Cultural Revolution, trying to rehabilitate intellectuals, artists, and others who had been terribly hurt by the Cultural Revolution, that this was something that people that Neil and his colleagues who came into contact with or worked with in Beijing were supportive of. This debate was translated around the world. It was obviously circulated in English because Monthly Review circulated it through the journal and circulated it through the book, which is circulating in the audience. It was also translated into Chinese, and because this slide of the cover of the Chinese edition, which was circulated privately, meaning confidentially at the time, is relatively small, mostly because of what my daughters would call my poor PowerPoint technique. I am sending around on the iPad the actual text of the Chinese translation of this debate from Monthly Review, which was very quickly translated by the Foreign Languages Press in Beijing, which at that point was doing primary translations of foreign political documents. And those of you who read Chinese can scroll through that document and see that every word of this debate was being translated and available to theoretical officials, political officials, and others in Beijing. It wasn't just in Chinese. This came out in Europe in French and Spanish editions. It was discussed by John Fairbank and others in reviews, New York Review of Books and others. It was discussed, and this is again a terrible example of PowerPoint that my daughters would criticize me for, in the leading leftist Indian political journal, the Economic and Political Weekly, EPW, which remains 30 years later, 40 years later, India's leading progressive political journal. It got very wide a discussion around the world. 35 years have now passed since that debate. Bettelheim moved away from China, dismissing China. He didn't have really anywhere to go after China. If China in the Cultural Revolution represented the purest variant of socialism that was available, if he was going to dispose of Deng Xiaoping and criticize Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues, there really wasn't any place to go at that point. North Korea and other countries were so far beyond the bounds of anything that was acceptable to discuss, even in the 70s and 80s, that Bettelheim stayed with theoretical work, but really stayed away from China, Cuba, and the others that he had been close to before. Neil, as all of you know, continued to work, as Professor Price so well explained, continued to work in Beijing until 1981. A number of visitors to Beijing talked with him about his challenge to this extraordinarily well-known, at the time, extraordinarily powerful French philosopher, powerful in academic and theoretical circles. I remember the first time I met Neil. I met him several times in Beijing in the 1970s, and I remember the first time I met him, and I remember it very well because of a very particular anecdote. We met at the Friendship Hotel, and I was scheduled to have dinner with him and with an American who had recently come out of about 10 years in prison during the Cultural Revolution, an American named Sidney Rittenberg, whom some of you know or have read about or have met. And Sidney and Neil and I went downtown in a car. At that point, foreign experts like Neil and Sidney, who lived at the Friendship Hotel in Beijing, could use subsidized taxis from the hotel. And we went downtown to what was reputed to have been Deng Xiaoping's, this is not a picture, Deng Xiaoping's favorite Sichuan restaurant before the Cultural Revolution, called, not surprisingly, the Sichuan restaurant, Sichuan Fandian, in central Beijing. And I'd met Sidney before, but I hadn't met Neil. We spent the taxi drive down, as I recall, talking about the monthly review debate, talking about the reaction to the monthly review debate in China, talking about the discussions that Neil in particular had with Communist Party and other personnel who were interested in the foreign reactions to the Deng Xiaoping re-emergence, reassumption of leadership. And then we got to the restaurant, and I tell this story because it told me something about Neil, who I was meeting for the first time that day. This would have been, I think, late summer or fall of '78. And we got to the restaurant, and as was the custom at the time, this has all changed, everything, virtually everything has changed in China. But when we got to the restaurant, the host, the person at the gate, the person at the table in front, said to us, some of you speak Chinese, said to us, 给你们司机什么样的菜，什么样的饭? Because at that point, and saying, what kind of food should we give your driver? Because at that point, the drivers were provided food when they went out because they were waiting to take people back to the Friendship Hotel or somewhere else. And Neil looked at the, what we would call a sort of maitre d' host, and said something that has stuck with me for many years, because I'm remembering and telling the story today. And he said something that surprised the maitre d'. He said in Chinese, and then I'll translate, he said, 跟我们一样, the same as us. Now that was a very interesting thing to say in the post-cultural revolution era because stratification was already beginning to take effect in Beijing. It had never really left Beijing, but it was beginning to reassert itself with remarkable force and remarkable speed in Beijing, even in 1977, 1978, 1979. By 1978, drivers were not being given the same treatment at the fancy Sichuan restaurant in Beijing that the guests were being given. And so when Neil said, 跟我们一样, the same as us, in Chinese, perfect Chinese, to the host at the restaurant, he looked up with some surprise. Because even by 1978, that's not how things were being done. Now there's a couple slides here that are a bit dark, again because of my poor PowerPoint technique. China has changed dramatically. There has been enormous prosperity in China as a result of the economic reforms that Charles Bettelheim criticized and that Neil Burton said in effect in 1978, hold on, let's wait and see that Chinese people have spoken, and we need to give them time to figure out what direction they want to take. This is a picture, it's unfortunately a bit dark on the slide, of new housing, middle-class housing complexes in Beijing. This is a picture, again, a bit dark here, of the McDonald's that have sprouted up around Beijing and around China. It's a particularly useful picture for me because it's an indication of the fact that China and the Chinese people may make choices in terms of economic reforms and privatization and a Chinese form of modernization that some of us might not necessarily agree with in all forms, but they are Chinese choices. They're not necessarily choices that everyone in China agrees with, but they're choices that China has made. And in effect, what Neil was saying in this debate, and those of you who are interested can actually read through the monthly review or the book that came out of it, was in effect, to digest the debate, it's too early to say. We should not be so quick on the basis of what was in effect Cultural Revolution propaganda to dismiss the new leadership and the new leadership's opening to economic reform, to letting people do more of what they want. We should give this some time to work itself out. Well, it's worked itself out in terms of prosperity. Again, too dark, but prosperity. It's worked itself out in terms of rapidly rising incomes and foreign investment. It's also worked itself out in terms of workers' strikes. This is one of the innumerable pictures of Chinese workers striking in southern China. I believe this is a picture from Hainan in recent years. It's worked itself out. That will look to you like a PowerPoint slide that's just too dark, but that's the January 12th pollution readings in Beijing from, 12 days ago. It's worked itself out in terms of, and again, this is too dark, it shows up better on the PowerPoint, the so-called black jails, private jails, in which petitioners who come to Beijing to petition the central government for relief are sometimes held in Beijing and are held in various parts of China. It's worked itself out in lots of different, both positive and negative ways. China today, as you all know, is an extraordinary study in the positives and the negatives of the reforms that Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues pushed forward beginning in 1977 and 1978 after the Cultural Revolution. I don't know because I only knew Neil in the late 1970s, fairly briefly, in Beijing before he and his family moved to Japan. I don't know, some family members and others here, and friends, Brian and others, would know how he reacted as the Chinese experiments in reforms in the post-Cultural Revolution era played out in the ways they have in the 1980s, the 1990s, and this decade. Extraordinary prosperity, growth in incomes, growth in flexibility in terms of educational arrangements, jobs, entrepreneurship for many hundreds of millions of Chinese. Continued poverty for many Chinese as well, and a variety of abuses, whether they're environmental abuses, labor abuses, human rights abuses, the black jails, in China as well. China is this study in contrast. So I don't know how Neil and others here would view those reforms from the perspective of this decade. But in 1978, when these questions were first coming to the fore, what direction should China take? There was this great split, exactly 35 years ago, in foreign progressive and academic groups, in which the Bettelheim forces, represented by Professor Charles Bettelheim, was in effect dismissing entirely what was happening in post-Cultural Revolution China and calling in effect for a return to the politics of the Cultural Revolution. And those like Neil and other foreigners who were in Beijing, who were in effect saying, there may be negatives that come from these reforms, but they seem to represent the direction in which the Chinese people currently want to go, and we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss them. So let me stop there with this wonderful picture that the family has also sent me of Neil in Shanghai, I believe on the Shanghai docks, in about 1973, 1974, and open it up to any questions that you have, and thank you for the opportunity to come here today.